career spanning 5 decades, David Bowie is one of the most successful recording artists of his generation. Effortlessly evolving with the times, he has managed to remain both relevant and influential, continually attracting new audiences whilst sustaining the devotion of his earlier fan base. Emerging as a fully fledged star in the 1970s, Bowie achieved global success as an innovator and artist, rising above his contemporaries to become the icon of a generation.
Having had the phenomenon of the Beatles and all the groups that came up in their wake and alongside them, when they split up, everybody thought it would be another group that would take over, that would be the world-dominating force in music. It would be another group. So everyone was looking for who's going to be the next Beatles, who's going to be the next Beatles. And it struck me really heavily one day, it's not a group, it's David Bowie.
Yet his road to success was far from steady. Throughout the 1960s, Bowie suffered many setbacks while searching for an authentic voice that would secure him an audience.
It just took a little bit longer for this country and the world to catch on to what David was doing. They caught on to the Kinks and all the other bands quicker, but David became much bigger than all of them.
This is the story of Bowie's ascension, from Bromley schoolboy to international superstar, from Davy Jones to Ziggy Stardust. David Robert Jones, the boy who would become Bowie, was born in Brixton, London in 1947. By 1953, the Jones family had moved to Bromley, and David was enrolled at the local junior school, Burnt Ash.
I first met David Bowie at Burnt Ash School. He was a year below me. I remember him being very small, very short little chap, always quite neat, tidy, clean and well-behaved. He didn't stand out in any way.
Not a particularly gifted student, David failed his exams. However, through his mother's persistence, he was accepted into Bromley Technical School in 1958.
After Burnt Ash, he followed me to, being a year younger, followed me to Bromley Technical School, which was pretty much a brand new school when I joined. And when he came along the next year, he fitted in. And I remember him, again, it didn't stand out in any way.
The only thing that stood out from the crowd was he was so dapper and so well dressed. I mean, when we was at school, we was obviously all in the same school uniform, but I mean, he always seemed to have, the best trousers and always looked smart and nice shirt and tie. And if you saw him out, I mean, he was always dressed in a suit, etc.
We were both from the north side of Bromley, sort of the side nearer London. It was a nice, pleasant area, very much suburbia. It was a friendly, more relaxed, less frenetic time than it is now. A good time to just grow up in, really. David, I would say, a very pleasant, very personable guy. Would always be easy to talk to and liked to talk to people. He would always expound his knowledge about music. And again, like all of us in those days, we were all besotted with all things American. And David very much liked American things, to the extent that he decided, or he listened, I believe, to the American Forces radio. And he then thought, what a good idea. We don't have baseball. He wasn't much of a footballer. I don't think he liked games generally. But he got this idea, just maybe we could play baseball. So he wrote or contacted a baseball team in America. And they thought, great, hey, this English guy. So they sent him bats, balls, hats, the gloves. And suddenly he appeared on the bus with all this stuff, and he started playing baseball with his schoolmates outside after school. And that lasted for a bit, and then, of course, he got fed up with it and went off it. But he was always trying new ideas.
He was always the all-American boy, and he was always seemed to be up for everything. He didn't get into as much mischief as the rest of us used to get into. Perhaps mischief is too light-hearted a word, but the rest of us used to sort of play about a lot, but he never seemed to. But I remember he had us all playing baseball once, or trying to get us all to play baseball, And another time he wrote off to the American embassy for the rules of American football, and they sent him down all the armoured jacket and shoulder pads, etc. And we had somebody come down from the Evening News that was taking photographs of us with all this gear.
It was really when he got to the art stream, when he got to the third year, and we split up then. You either did languages or art or engineering more. But he went into art, not surprisingly. And it was then he just started to get into his music and started to really get into art generally.
Under the tutelage of charismatic arts teacher Owen Frampton, and with strong influences at home, Bowie's interest in music and the arts developed.
One thing that's really important about Bowie is that he always loved music. He was around music from a very early age, and his father was a press officer for Bernardo's, and sort of press officers were quite a new thing at that point. Now sort of every second or third person seems to be one, but then it was quite a new thing. So he'd been used to sort of growing up and seeing sort of stars and celebrities go to children's homes with his father and things like that. And also his brother brought home a lot of records that Bowie got into, so already he'd absorbed an awful lot of influences, and it was almost entirely natural that what he would then want to do is to get into playing music.
I remember him talking very much, as a lot of us did at the time. We were all very keen on Buddy Holly, and it was quite the sort of the thing to be. He was the person that you were quite cool in a way to like him. He liked Little Richard. He was quite an icon at the time of the early rock stars. And he talked endlessly about, on the bus back from Keston, where we were at school, back into the centre of Bromley, for ages just about music. Latterly, of course, he then started performing and would talk about functions, gigs that he did.
In 1962, David joined his first band, the Conrads, a Shadows-inspired outfit who toured local youth clubs.
I remember specifically on one occasion he was quite delighted that he appeared with Johnny Kidd and the Pirates, who were quite a big name at the time, although he only had perhaps 2 or 3 hits. And David showed me a scrap of paper on it that he'd written, "Good working tonight," and that was from Johnny Kidd, and that was, wow, Johnny Kidd, this was really something. And David took that to be, well, someone that's been in the profession rates me, and that was obviously a spur to him that kept him going.
It was during 1962 that David suffered an injury during a fight with fellow pupil George Underwood that would affect his appearance forever.
The way I remember it was George Underwood. I think David was after his girlfriend or something, and George was moaning about it. And the week before, me and some of the lads who I'd been out with, a guy called Malcolm had just walked up to somebody, tapped him on the shoulder, and as he was much bigger than him, as he turned round, he'd whacked him one. So I said to George, I said, go up, tap him on the shoulder. As he turns round, whack him one. And I understood that's what had happened, but obviously for the school, they said it didn't happen. And I read in his biography that they said it didn't happen like that. But apparently he got hit on the side of the head, and it put the blood across the back of his eye, and I had to actually take his eye out of its socket to clean the back of it off, and then put it back in again, which is why I had the frozen pupil. But I mean, as far as I understand, it was George Underwood who did it, but I mean, whether or not it was, I don't know.
The resultant contrast in eye colour would come to signify David's otherness later in his career. In Bromley, however, he was beginning to attract attention for other reasons.
David's sort of rise to fame, although it was slow, he would after school he would be around town. He had long hair, and I can remember him specifically walking around Bromley on a Saturday and seeing him with sort of suede long boots with tassels on them. And I thought, we wouldn't have dreamt of wearing that. We'd have been too self-conscious generally. But it didn't bother him at all. He was around, and people knew him. A lot of people knew him around town, see him. To be honest, I think most people didn't think he'd get anywhere. He was just a sort of a crazy guy at the time, different to everybody else in his style of dress, doing things that we wouldn't dream of doing.
After leaving Bromley Technical School, Bowie disbanded the Conrads to join his second band, the King Bees.
Where the Conrads were doing sort of R&B and soul, he went into the King Bees, and the King Bees sort of developed that further, the whole R&B thing, because he had a huge appetite. I mean, he absolutely adored Little Richard. He was listening to the Motown things that were coming through.
In 1964, they recorded Liza Jane, David's first single. A simple pop record, it vanished without a trace, and Bowie subsequently left the band. His manager, Leslie Conn, persuaded him to join the Manish Boys, a group that would bring him much greater attention.
It was a fairly established act he joined, and he wanted it to be Davy Jones and the Manish Boys, and I don't think that led necessarily to a lot of tension, but it was quite clear that he wasn't, although several times in his career he sort of retreated into a group, he's always been the leader of that group as much as he's ever sort of tried to protest otherwise.
He came to join the Manish Boys in a very oblique sort of way. We had a contract with Dick James Music, which was Northern Songs, I think. And our manager at Northern Songs was Leslie Conn. And we'd been there a few weeks, and Leslie Conn said, "Would you like a new singer?" And we said, "No, thank you, we've got enough mouths to feed." So he said, "But he's good, he's great, he'll be good for you." And he has already made a record. So, that sort of success could rub off on you, and who knows, you'll make a record too. So we said, okay, let's just give him a trial. Leslie brought him down on the following Sunday, and he walked into the living room where we were all rehearsing, and instantly we said, okay, that's fine. We doesn't have to sing even. He just looked the part, and he was dressed in buckskin and, thigh-high boots and so on and so on. So that was it, really, and the hair. And he did sing, but we weren't so interested in the singing as we were his appearance, basically.
Even at this early stage in his career, David's sights were set solely on fame.
We were more interested in the musical content of the thing than really the fame and fortune in those days, except David, I think, because he was probably more interested in the future than he was the actual bands itself. The bands were a stepping stone to his success, really. He had his eyes set on the future, basically.
As well as gigging extensively with the Manish Boys, Bowie was also seeking the public eye from outside of the music world.
During the time of the Manish Boys, he did that thing where he was on the BBC with the campaign for long hair, where he was on Cliff Mitchell-Moore's Tonight programme talking about he'd been victimised for having long hair, which was, again, talk about the sort of press officer side of things, that he already was looking for an eye to a good story.
Well, David was always up to some scheme to hit the public eye. And it was his idea to come up with this notion that he would form a society for the preservation of animal filament, it was called, which was long hair. Well, long hair in those days wasn't so long as you imagine. I mean, I've probably got long hair now, to a 60s person. And anyway, he came up with this scheme, and he got several people, famous people, to sponsor it, and we all had longish hair, to back him up, and it made a lot of newspapers. Virtually all the newspapers ran the story, and then it ended up on television with the Cliff Mitchell-Moore Tonight programme, I think it was.
It's all got to stop. They've had enough. The worms are turning. The rebellion of the long hairs is getting underway. A 17-year-old, David Jones, has just founded the Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Long-Haired Men. Now, exactly who's being cruel to you?
Well, I think we're all fairly tolerant, but for the last 2 years we've had comments like "darling" and "can I carry a handbag" thrown at us. And I think it's just had to stop now.
Of course, it was all just a joke, really. But it was anything to get known and get noticed.
I think he saw with the Manish Boys that quite quickly it wasn't the vehicle he wanted. And now, you know, he was almost already a veteran. He'd been through 3 groups, had a level of success with each of them, and was becoming a boy most likely to.
On leaving the Manish Boys, David Jones looked to The Who for inspiration, changed his image and joined the mod-obsessed Lower Third.
If you ask people, you know, bands David Bowie was in before he was David Bowie, if you like, you know, the Lower Third is one that always sort of springs to mind. And I think this was where he started to actually find his own voice, albeit it was largely someone else's. It was The Who's, if you like, at this point, because, you know, the one thing Bowie has always been is obsessed with style, and it's always been, you know, as much part of the package as the music. And he started to completely engulf himself in mod style.
As well as being prepared to change his image to fit the times, David also decided to change an element of himself that he'd been dissatisfied with since school.
David Jones is quite a common name. Also, at that point, the Monkees had just broken big over here, and David Jones was everyone's favourite pin-up. And I think there was also a David Jones working in someone's management company. There was a lot of David Joneses around. So he looked into American mythology, which is again something he was to visit several times in his life, and go for the classic Bowie name, or Bowie as it's often mispronounced, but I think he loves Bowie now. And the Bowie, you know, from the Bowie knife, and there was all the images of him being sort of cutting at the cutting edge and the cutting blade and all of that. And here was sort of David Bowie. The Lower Third sort of did gather quite a head of steam, and they worked with Pi Records, which at the time was sort of third behind EMI Decca. So again, he had the right deals, but he just couldn't get that hit single, and it was proving very elusive. So again, in sort of Bowie's style at that point, he walked away from the Lower Third and created a group called The Buzz.
The Buzz were designed specifically for Bowie by his manager Ralph Hawson, and this time he would be the undisputed focus of the group. The first member enlisted was guitarist John Hutchinson.
I was in London waiting to decide whether to go back to Sweden, where I'd spent a year playing with a Swedish band. The Marquee Club in Wardour Street, I'd heard of it, so I walked in. There was one guy there, Jack Barry, the manager. I asked him if anybody was looking for a guitarist, and he gave me a phone number. And I auditioned the following Saturday, and I met David, Spike, the roadie, and Ralph, the manager. Ralph had arranged the auditions because he'd they'd fallen out with the previous band. I did an audition, and they liked my Swedish clothes, and I played the Bo Diddley rhythm that he asked me to play. And they said, right, we'll form a band basically around you. I got picked and said, well, we've got a bass player that we've seen that we like, and we've got a drummer. We need a keyboard player. And I got Chow Boys, a guy from Scarborough, an old friend of mine that played keyboards, and he brought his Hammond B3 down on the train. Well, Chow and I played rhythm and blues, really. And David liked that stuff, but David had written his own songs. So we had a kind of mixture of rhythm and blues and David's songs, which we played in a rhythm and blues style. And then when we started gigging, David decided we should do some covers of Tamla Motown stuff. So it was kind of an interesting mix with a Hammond-based four-piece band and a guy doing his own thing. So I thought it was a very good band, and we weren't following any pattern. even in those days, he had originality.
I think the thing with this period, being managed by Horton, was that he really did start to sort of hone his material, and he just wrote. He wrote an awful lot of material, which he was able to then use over the next sort of couple of years.
David could be very intense, I would say, compared to most musicians that I'd worked with. But he was unusual in that he was writing all his own stuff, and it was different. He was he always has been, basically, a nice guy, you know. He's just an ordinary guy that's got very, very famous. So he was a nice guy, good friend.
In 1967, Bowie split with the Buzz and began working on his first album for Decca Records subsidiary D-Ram. It was released later that year, titled simply David Bowie.
He recorded this album for D-Ram, and he worked with sort of Decca house producer Mike Vernon, and it created this very unusual sound, which was like a sort of Baroque music hall.
Well, there was a lot of that sort of thing about at the time, you know, and I'd like to say I immediately detected in him a rather special artiste, but I don't think I really did. I just thought he was another. I mean, there are a lot of people doing stuff that now sounds slightly cutesy and faintly irritating, but he seemed to have attracted more attention with his cutesy and faintly irritating stuff than other people had done.
I think what was different was the way he was singing. There was absolutely no nod to America whatsoever in that. He was reinforcing his Bromleyness, as he's called it. The South London vowels were out. But he made this record, which has been compared many times to that of Anthony Newley. So you had this album of these strange little vignettes about, Sell Me a Coat and Rubber Band and She's Got Medals. And one of the absolute key tracks on this album is The Laughing Gnome. And Bowie, of course, has had a very troubled relationship with that song.
I think it's unfair to keep throwing the Laughing Gnome back in David Bowie's face. The point is, he was influenced by Anthony Newley. And I think what influenced him was not the kind of all-singing, all-dancing, musical West End Anthony Newley, but there'd been a very peculiar TV series he'd been in, which was a very avant-garde thing called The World or something like that. I can't remember what it was called, but it was... And I'm convinced that is also what sort of partly set David Bowie on his avant-garde path.
You can almost hear on that track and on that album this sort of tremendous relief. It's like, I'm actually making an album now. I've been trying for 3 or 4 years, and this time it looks like it might actually happen. And I think that really comes across. It's certainly not an album that's in people's David Bowie top 10s, and nor is The Laughing Gnome in their top 100s, but there is a certain naive charm.
If you listen to that it's progressed from that one to the next one, and each one, it's like the Beatles when they started off with Please Please Me, and then it went to, with the Beatles, and then you got until they come up with the Sgt. Pepper, and every album got better and better, and I think that's the same with David.
Despite the album's commercial failure, it did attract the attention of mime artist Lindsay Kemp. Hearing about this interest, Bowie enlisted in Kemp's mime class, and the teacher-student relationship quickly evolved until it incorporated all aspects of David's life.
He was, the mime artist that the hippies loved, and he taught Bowie a tremendous amount about stage craft, stage presence, as well as the rudiments of mime. Also, after the sort of D-Ram material failed, Bowie just went and studied with him and then actually went out on tour with him. And if you think of, you know, today's pop climate, it would almost be unthinkable to hold a pop career, to go off and study mime. And it wasn't necessarily that he was doing it to come back as this, you know, my next album will be completely in mime, which obviously doesn't sound that brilliant anyway. But he, you know, he went and did it because he wanted to. And of course, the theatricality that he gained from Kemp courses through everything he does, even to today. But you know, you see the footage of Ziggy, and he is bringing this sort of compendium of experience to those performances.
Bowie immersed himself in mime for more than a year, and it would play a major part in his next group, formed in late 1968.
He moved into yet another act, which was called Feathers, which was with his then girlfriend Hermione Farthingale and John Hutchison. And if you like, this was the start of the next big change in his career. We'd seen the R&B boy, we'd seen the soul boy, we'd seen the mod, we'd seen the musical entertainer, and now it moved into the hippie phase.
Feathers came about because I'd gone to Canada. I'd gone back to the day job and gone to Canada. When I came back from Canada, I hadn't a clue what I was going to do. So I called David, and he was at the same number. I might have even called him at home because I knew where he lived, and I'd met his mum and dad, been to his house in Bromley. Anyway, I got in touch, and I suppose I was just wondering what to do next. And David said, well, it's funny you should call, but our guitarist is leaving. I've got this really interesting thing that I think you'll like. Why don't you come down and see if you like it? So I did that. I went to London to see him when I got back from Canada, and it was what he called a multimedia experience. So playing acoustic guitars, singing harmonies, that was good fun. Completely different to being in a rock band. It was very much an acoustic, experimental kind of thing. I remember Pink Floyd were knocking around at the same time, and I kind of wondered if we were anything like them. But I never saw them, so I have no idea. Probably we weren't. I think we had David and Hermione dancing. David was doing mime. One of my jobs was to turn the tape machine on so that he would mime to it. And it was very controlled. It wasn't rock and roll.
In 1969, Bowie moved back to Bromley. While continuing his work in mime, he arranged folk nights at the 3 Tons pub in Beckenham. Here, he met Keith Christmas, a folk singer who regularly played the Sunday night session.
I can remember him as a 12-string strummer of the acoustic guitar, and as a writer of not very good songs. And he was the resident at the 3 Tons in Beckenham, round about 1969. It was the best club on earth. It was brilliant, that place. It was fabulous. It was so 60s. It was so late 60s London. It was the archetypal late 60s gig. If you wanted, I mean, folk music, acoustic music ruled. I mean, it absolutely ruled the earth. I mean, Bob Dylan to start it all, but it ruled the planet. And bands ruled the planet, and long hair and smoking. But of course, if you wanted to smoke, you still had to go and be very discreet because it was still very illegal. He tended to stay in the background a bit. He wasn't very obtrusive. He ran the club, and he booked me, and I was one of his favourite guests. So I got regular work there. And he used to open up the evening and strumming. He used to play 12-string, and he used to strum. And he used to open up the evening and sing a couple of songs, and that was it. Nobody really took too much notice of him. He was a really nice bloke. I mean, he was very South London, very middle class. He came across that way. Very nice, very quiet, unassuming. I had the feeling he was a bit of a scamp. I always got the feeling he had a sense of mischief about him. And he had a twinkle in his eye, that's for sure.
Although he involved himself in various projects, Bowie's career seemed to be heading nowhere. Despite all his hard work, fame appeared to be an elusive dream.
He was on tour with Mark Bolan, and this presumably must have been some kind of low point in his career, because he wasn't even singing at that stage. He was doing a mime act, and I'm not much of an authority on mime, but you know, he'd be doing that kind of man locked in a phone box, kind of, you know, all this sort of thing. And I remember we treated him, I hope politely, but you know, it wasn't seen as a great coup having him on the tour. And I think he was even, there was the rarest of God's creatures, an Australian sitar player on the bill as well. And I'm not entirely sure that Bowie wasn't even billed below him. But I remember sitting in the theatre in Liverpool and sort of, you know, God, is it 8 o'clock already? David, you're on! kind of thing, shouting down the corridor. And he'd go out and do his act. So, I mean, he was a fairly, you know, humble, he was in a fairly humble position, really, at that stage.
I think he could have, from time to time, wondered if he was ever going to crack it. Because I don't think it was so much that he was from out of London. I think even in those days, certainly we from the north thought that Bromley, Beckenham was London. I think that right deep down, he just had a very strong belief in himself. Stronger than I thought he had, actually. I kept leaving. But I realise now that he had a very strong belief in himself, yeah.
You've got to have huge drive and ambition to be successful. There's an awful lot of people out there who've got lots of drive and ambition without any talent, who you've got to compete with. It's no use just having the talent and expecting it to be discovered. So you've got to have that incredible belief in yourself. Yeah, I think so.
Certainly in today's sort of pop idol culture, David Bowie would not have existed. He would have, you know, after his second single, he would have disappeared, or he might have had a career on the pub circuit.
I think I did believe that he would make it, yeah. I always thought that he would make it, to be honest. I didn't think it would be as big as it is now, but I did believe he would make it, yes.
In my limited experience, people only tell you that they saw genius blossoming after the genius has blossomed, and with the gift of hindsight. So I would love to be able to say, yes, as soon as he walked into the room, I detected something magical about David Bowie, and time has proven me right. But that would be complete bollocks, frankly, and I think anybody who tells you that is probably lying.
In the end, it was one song that set Bowie on the road to glory. Despite his difficult start, by the end of 1969, Bowie had entered the public eye and achieved the first of many hits.
I can remember seeing the Stones in the park. And there was 1 million people there, and it was hot that day. And before the Stones came on, in between, I can't remember, it was Donovan or somebody like that, they played Space Oddity, and it had just come out, and it was just starting to go in the charts. And it just fitted like a glove. You could just tell this was going to be huge. And I knew then he was going to be huge. That's when I knew.
We actually recorded several songs that we'd used in our Feathers act, and also after Hermione had left, we did a few gigs as Bowie and Hutch, and we decided we'd put them on a Revox. We had a machine in his flat, and we recorded maybe a dozen songs, and Space Oddity was just one of them, and that was to send to America. Eventually it was the tape that was to get him a record deal after I'd left, but we basically just sat on the corner of the bed and played through the songs. But then, a little bit later, we made what was to be a promotional film. The three of us, Hermione, David and myself, made what is still available as Love You Till Tuesday. And for that film, we went into a studio and we David employed some session musicians, and we recorded what they now call the original version of Space Oddity. Space Oddity was written as a two-part song. I was ground control and he was Major Tom, and we recorded it with that in mind. We sang those two parts. After I'd left, gone back to get another day job, David did it as a solo.
The solo version of Space Oddity became Bowie's calling card. It secured him a lucrative deal with Mercury Records and, on its release in autumn 1969, found an audience enticed both by the subject matter and by the artist.
It was at the time of the man first landed on the moon. People were fascinated by it. People were obsessed with space. And it was a pun on 2001, the Stanley Kubrick film, 2001, A Space Odyssey. So this was called Space Oddity, which was a pun on that, which obviously everyone got straight away. And so it was immediately very intriguing because it was a very unusual subject to write a song about.
It coincided with the first space shot, and it had, with that kind of ethereal voice he's got, it fitted exactly the style of music at the time. It just fitted perfectly. It fitted the time, fitted what people wanted. I mean, I personally thought it was a bit of a depressing song because the guy dies in it, but it was very clever, very unique.
It's difficult to know why any record's successful. Space Oddity, I mean, superficially, quite clearly, just because it was kind of spacey, and had a kind of story to it, but enough left unsaid to have you puzzling slightly over what it all meant.
It was very spacey, and when it first starts out, the chords to it are very spacey and weary, and Mick Wayne's solo in that, I think, had a lot to do with that. If you listen to the solo in that, the guitarist Mick Wayne, the guitarist is Junior's Eyes. And all the slide bits away, it's not a bottleneck, it's Mick's cig lighter. He had a little metal cig lighter. And it's his cigarette lighter doing all them, And I always remember Mick telling me on the end of the solo, there's a bit where they couldn't get out of the solo. And Mick had to just detune his machine head. When he goes, da-da-da-da, this is Major Tom. That was Mick's, yeah.
His persona really has been around the sort of slightly otherworldly thing. The man who fell to earth and Starman and things like that. I think that element is there. I think that it comes back to outer space and the unknown and stuff like that.
Rather unexpected, actually, given his form prior to that. And I quite like it when somebody just makes a record which seems to go against what it is that they've done previously, and if you'd written them off, it's quite good to be proven wrong, I think.
Bowie went to work on an album. The result was another eponymous long player, later repackaged as Space Oddity. Displaying obvious signs of his folk leanings, Bowie had recruited his 3 Tons colleague Keith Christmas on several tracks.
When I got to know him in the studio, he asked me if I'd come and play guitar with him on this series of tracks he was putting down, and it became just known as David Bowie, the album. I think it's been reissued and given another name now, probably Space Oddity. But it was a strange album because it was a bunch of acoustic songs with just me and him playing and him singing, a bunch of songs with backing band, and then this one track, Space Oddity, that stood out a mile because it had probably had more money spent on Space Oddity than the rest of the album put together. And this was a superbly produced, of course, thing. It's classic track now.
The album, which was initially, is now known as Space Oddity. Originally it was just known as David Bowie, or in America it was Man of Words and Man of Music. And it's quite an odd record. It's almost like Space Oddity and this collection of sort of assorted freakeries. And I think that was reflected in its immense lack of sales.
Dismissed by many critics as a one-hit wonder after the commercial failure of the album, Bowie concentrated on touring. In Scotland, he was supported by Junior's Eyes, who had become his new backing band.
Bowie had some gigs in Scotland. We did like a Radio 1 club. They used to have I always remember we did that, and it was on with the Swinging Blue Jeans. And when I was about 14 and 15, Swinging Blue Jeans was one of my sort of idol groups, the Hollies. And here I am, I'm with the Swinging Blue Jeans, and we was like this new underground band, and they was like supporting us, And so we did these. We'd go on and back David. We just recorded the album, so we basically just played his album,
In April, Bowie had met Angela Barnett, an American girl hanging out in swinging London. By the end of the year, they had moved into Haddon Hall in Bromley, along with Bowie's producer, Tony Visconti, and John Cambridge.
Haddon Hall was, when you look at it, it was a great big house in Beckenham. I remember it was on the main road, and David just had this sort of, the downstairs, I think on the left was the kitchen. We had the first bedroom on the left. David's bedroom was directly on the right. Tony Visconti's was in the corner, in the back, you know, yeah. And we just basically slept on a mattress. It wasn't a bed, it was just like, you'd go and buy this old mattress, you know. You'd just walk about as at your own house. I remember the only thing we used to eat was like toast with Marmites. You know, everybody would go and buy some toast and Marmite, and then we'd maybe go down to the pub down the road, the 3 Tons, which David used to play at. It was just, yeah, just like an open house where you treat it as your own, you know.
To the surprise of their friends, Bowie and Angela married early the next year at the Bromley Registry Office to little fanfare. John Cambridge would become an impromptu best man.
David's wedding, yes, I remember when we was at, I think he either came up the night before or 2 days before, and he just sort of said, John, I'm getting married. You know, what? You know, I'm getting married on tomorrow. Oh, you know, and I always remember, and this is quoted in some of the books, and it's true, and he says to me, will you be a witness? I said, yeah, of course I'll be a witness, you know. And I think Tony Visconti was going to be his best man, but I'm sure he had a session, I think it was with the Strobes or someone, so Tony couldn't make it. Even afterwards, David Joe said, oh yeah, John was my best man, weren't you, John? You know, don't think there wasn't really a best man, but I suppose, you know, I was maybe one of the only fella there. So, and that's true. When we got to the wedding, and his mother had come, and I don't think she even knew he was getting married. You know, I think she'd found out at the registry or something. And I always remember I'm sort of sat like this waiting, and David and Angie right at the front on the table, and it's like little school chairs. You know, not very big room. And he said, can the witnesses come forward to sign it? And I think another girl who was in the flat at the time called Claire, I think she was in the flat round the corner, downstairs. And I got up my chair to go, and his mother sort of, in front of me, stormed up and went to the thing, and she sort of went, and you know, and Bowie sort of looked round at me and sort of went, I thought to say, it's my mother, so, you know, cool.
Angela would become a vital part of Bowie's personal and professional life over the following 3 years. Heavily influencing both his music and his image, she aided the singer's rise from one-hit wonder to global superstar.
I think one of the significant things around this period was that Bowie sort of formed a band came together that, unlike all the other bands that he'd been in, and by this point, you know, there were many, was that here was a band of sort of equal partners. Obviously, Bowie was the star and the leader, but there was a lot of sort of contribution given in. And the first sort of example were called The Hype or Hype, which had Tony Visconti, who, as well as being a producer, is a tremendously accomplished bass player on bass, John Cambridge on drums, and one of the most significant characters in Bowie's story, Mick Ronson, on guitar.
When Johnny's Eyes sort of finished, I think Tim got offered another job with, I think, the Terry Reid Fantasia, or something like that. I know it was Terry Reid, who was quite big in the States, just like a 3-piece, a bit like The Nice and Emerson, Lake Palmer, that sort of lineup. And so Tim was leaving to join this band. And so, like, rather than getting another, I think we tried to get another guitarist, and it just wasn't working out. And so we was coming home, and I remember we was doing it. I always remember we was playing in Rotherham, and Tim Rennick says to me, he said, "Oh, John, will you ring Visconti up?" He said, "Will you ring him tomorrow? He wants a word with you." And I thought it was just going to be a session or something. I'd done some sessions for Tony, and he said, "Oh," he said, "David's forming a band, and he wants you to be the drummer." So I thought, "Oh, yeah, you know." I thought I was coming home, that sort of, you know, and so I stayed down there. So that was the band. That was, so there was, and Visconti was going to play bass, so we needed a guitarist. But I kept saying, "There's a real good kid I know in Hull. He's a real," and they sort of looked at me. He's like, "Oh, well, yeah, all right, John, you know," and I was pestering and pestering. They didn't really believe me, and they thought I was just messing about, you know. So like, I pestered them that much until Tony and David said, all right, John, bring him down, we'll see what he's like, you can't do any harm, you know.
The guitarist who John Cambridge eventually convinced to join the hype was Mick Ronson, who had played with Cambridge earlier in the Rats. His introduction into the fabric of the hype was, however, far from seamless.
He came back to Haddon Hall and stayed the night, and I said to David, this is Mick Mohammed. And the next day they sort of got out the acoustic guitars in the bedroom and started playing away, and they just hit it off. And David said, oh, we're doing a John Peel show. I think it was maybe the day after or a couple of days after. Do you want to stay and do it? So Mick says, yeah, you know. So I think he'd brought his guitar down with him, his Les Paul. So we ended up doing the John Peel show, you know, which was really terrible, you know, when, you know, if you ever hear it now, you know. As I've said before, people used to say, well, it was good, it was raw, you know, and like they'd say, like, the early bands like the Stones, well, the Stones in the early days was raw, you know. It wasn't raw, it was crap. Yeah, so, but we'd finish a song and Mick would still be playing, or the wrong chords, but, you know, all that sort of thing. But it was live, you know, you couldn't say, whoa, let's do it again, you know. And it just went out, you know, but that was Mick's first gig.
Mick Ronson was really important in as much that he could really play. And that's not saying Bowie couldn't really play, because he can, but I think with all sort of great ideas, people, they need someone who's going to make that song come to life. And I think, you know, he was very, very accomplished at being able to do that.
Mick, as a person, was quite unique. He's a very genuine person, a nice guy, you know, a very straightforward guy. And in a way, that's how his music was as well. But more than anything else, he'd got an element of the showman in him, which David brought out.
Mick Ronson was the alchemist to Bowie's magic, you know. He really was a very important part of that image, I think. And a very good musician too, and a great shame he's dead.
When we was in the Rats, we just did cover versions, but all we played was Hendrix, Cream, Zeppelin, anything heavy. That's what was into. Mick was into Jeff Beck. You know, Jeff Beck was his idol. You know, I don't care what anybody says about what was Mick's idol, or Hendrix, Clapton, at the time. It was Jeff Beck. Mick was a big Jeff Beck fan. And so when David's doing these songs, well, Mick's it's like somebody coming with this nice little song on a 12-string, and Mick just turns it into something like Stairway to Heaven by Zeppelin, which I imagine that probably started out something like that, you know, and you get Jimmy Page there and it just becomes a different song. And I think that's what Mick did, he just turned it around, right, it's going to be like this, you know. And of course David loved it, you know, he loved it, you know. I mean, when I was in Haddon Hall, I had my Zeppelin albums and playing it, and he loved all, you know. So I think it rubbed off on him.
Bowie's next record, The Man Who Sold the World, unsurprisingly bore the influence of Ronson's rock background. Full of crunching riffs and thumping bass lines, it could not have been further from the modest folk of the Space Oddity album.
The Man Who Sold the World's a very odd album, and I think it's a very interesting album, because it's like Bowie playing hard rock. And whereas Space Oddity was very sort of trippy and whimsical, here was an album where he just sort of, everything went up a notch. You could tell that the game was being raised. Mick Ronson came in on guitar. Visconti did a fantastic production job. And you get these songs on there like Width of a Circle and Black Country Rock. I mean, Black Country Rock, it always sounds like Slade. It's this very, very sort of unlike David Bowie music.
Man Who Sold the World. Yeah, that's another one that it progressed, and I think the songs got more melodic. Even, what was it, the title track, The Man Who Sold the World, you know. Once again, the Ron Oz riff, that'd been Mick Ronson's, you know. That was Mick Ronson's riff. David wrote the songs, really good songs, and Mick arranged them and put his heavy rock or whatever, you know. Clever guy. Clever guys.
I think the cover was probably one of Bowie's first iconic images, and it showed that he was sort of unafraid to be who he was, laying there on a chaise lounge, cards scattered around, you know. Had he lost some bet and had to dress up in drag? Was he, you know, who knows? But the mystery was there.
Throughout 1971, Bowie worked non-stop. Despite the man who sold the world's unimpressive sales, Bowie embarked on his first American tour and played the Glastonbury Festival. At the end of the year, another new album emerged, Hunky Dory. It was his strongest yet.
You get the notion of not just an isolated classic on there amongst some filler. It's just track after track. You know, you got changes on there, which, you know, even today, most people will just identify that one song with David Bowie. Life on Mars, which has got to be probably his deftest touch, the whole orchestration on there as well. And the most interesting thing about it is once he got it out, he'd moved on so far already, and already in all the interviews around the time of Hunky Dory coming out, he started to talk about the next project. And I think there's always that moment in pop when, you know, whether it's the planets aligning or something, where, you know, he knew that something was happening and the years of work were paying off. You know, this wasn't a fresh off the block performer with nothing to say. He had been there, seen it, done it. I think Hunky Dory was the real sort of catalyst for that, because I think if that record hadn't been as strong, I don't think his confidence would have been as strong.
While promoting Hunky Dory, Bowie's new project emerged. Drawing on the alien otherness that had struck a chord with audiences in 1969, as well as the theatricality of mime and stagecraft, Bowie unleashed Ziggy Stardust and the Spiders from Mars.
Because he'd worked so hard, it was only like a natural extension of how hard he'd been working until 1972, where, you know, the fame was rocketing, you know, from Starman onwards.
Ziggy Stardust and the Spiders from Mars was a masterstroke. Not simply a breakthrough album, a stage show or an image, it was a complete package which would propel Bowie to stardom. The first single from the Ziggy Stardust album, Starman, became the Spiders' signature tune. It was also Bowie's first hit since Space Oddity. From the moment it crashed into the charts, there was no looking back. Ziggy Stardust and David Bowie had arrived.
I've thought a few times about how he got from being a fairly unprepossessing young man sitting on the grass at Beckenham to being Ziggy Stardust. And I think one of the key things is that I think he did that because he really enjoyed doing it. He wanted to do it. He loved it. He loved dressing up. He loved the theatricality. He loved that stuff. And I think it shows through in what he did, is just a sheer enthusiasm for that part.
We're going to New York next week. Can you come? And it was as quick as that. I just told my boss I was leaving and going to New York. And I joined an already fairly successful outfit in New York. My role really was to play 12-string, because David had previously played 12-string with the Spiders from Mars, but he wanted more freedom to move around the stage. And the idea was that he got somebody to play guitar and who could also do backing vocals. I think it was a bit of a budget cut, so we didn't get backing vocalists. So Jeff McCormack and I practiced our falsettos, and we did the girly vocals instead. I found it quite an experience. My first gig with them, after sort of playing in local pubs again, in Scarborough, was at Radio City Music Hall, which was a huge venue. Our entrance was up from the floor in a stage riser with steam curtains behind us, and that was just a taste for the next few months.
The Ziggy Stardust tour was immense. Bowie surrounded himself with an entourage of young talents, photographers, costume designers, bodyguards and hairstylists. His fame was as carefully constructed as his character, and with Ziggy, the music was arguably less important than the image.
His appearance matched the content of the music, so he had a package, and I think David's notion of himself was as a package, that he could produce music to accompany his appearance and so on and so on. He did it perfectly with Ziggy Stardust. Even if you didn't know who he was, you couldn't ignore his image.
If David had come on stage singing Ziggy with a tuxedo on, you know, and all this lot, nobody would have said anything, but you get sort of like people at work said, did you see that silly bugger last night with all that makeup on his face and David Bowie? But these would be old fellas, you know, and they remember his name because of what if he'd have come on in a black tuxedo, you know, they wouldn't know who he is. And that's part and parcel of the, you know, of getting there.
It had all the theatricality that he had shown promise of in Beckenham, but writ large. And he had Mick Ronson with him, who was sort of almost trying to upstage him on the platform, shoes, and it was a circus, but the music was good. It was the perfect combination of theatre and music, and that's what he managed to do. That's what he created with Ziggy Stardust, and that's what the world was ready for about then as well, I think.
His image was everything, because he was more of an actor than any of his contemporaries. Even before we knew that he could act actually and do things like Elephant Man and The Man Who Fell to Earth and stuff like that. It was an actor on stage. It was somebody dressing up and being a role, a character which wasn't him.
I'm very much a character when I go on stage, I feel. I mean,
Like an actor?
Yeah, I believe in my part all the way down the line, right the way down. But I do play it for all it's worth, because that's the way I do my stage thing. That's part of what Bowie's supposedly all about. I'm an actor.
By 1973, Bowie's career had gone stratospheric. While continuing the sellout tour with the Spiders, he released another album, Aladdin Sane. In Britain, it was the fastest-selling record since the Beatles' heyday. Incorporating the title character into the Spiders from Mars show, Bowie was now both creatively and commercially on the crest of a wave. It was on the 3rd of July at the Hammersmith Odeon that it all came to a sudden and unexpected end.
Hammersmith Odeon was one to remember, really, because it was a big gig right at the end of the 3 tours around the world. And to us, it was just another gig. We were actually planning to go back to the States. What happened was that the first clue that I had that something was a little bit different about that gig was that David said to me, don't start Rock and Roll Suicide. I used to play the intro on 12-string. He said, don't play the intro until I give it the nod. I thought, well, he must be going to say something. Well, he did. He said, thanks very much, we're retiring, you know, and the band kind of looked at each other and I started playing, and when we came off it was people were looking at each other. Woody and Trevor were a bit taken aback. We were all saying, what did he say? He said, we've just been fired. We got fired on stage. And as it turned out, that was the last gig we did, but we didn't know about it at the time. Just another real good gig. But that was it, the end of the road for the Spiders, yeah. I got in my car and drove back to Scarborough and got another proper job.
By Ziggy Stardust, it was, you know, he was huge by that time, so that when he killed him off, that was huge news. Huge, you know, well, it seemed to be at the time.
When Bowie killed Ziggy, if you like, at Hammersmith Odeon, and the famous quote, "This is the last show we're ever going to do," I think there was a genuine feeling that at that point he'd had enough, because, you know, ironically, after wanting it for so long, the great cliche of careful what you wish for, it all sort of happened at that point. And I think he just genuinely needed a break.
The suspension of Bowie's career was very short. Ziggy may have gone, but Bowie, his music and his persona continued to mature and develop. The sudden change in direction would come to characterise Bowie's later career.
Once he had set himself up, or intentionally or not, he was the next big thing, then he'd got to keep on evolving, and that's where it gets very difficult, because if you keep on being ahead of your audience, the underground love you and the avant-garde love you, but other people haven't actually caught up with you, and then you've changed again. And I actually admire that. I think that's a great quality. And a lot of people don't do that. They find this persona that's worked very well, and then they stick with it because all the people in the so-called industry go, well, no, that's really nice, we like that, keep doing it the same. Now, of course, the last thing you want to do is keep doing it the same if you're an artist.
You never quite knew what you were going to get, and this at a time when predictability was seen as a virtue, and I can understand that up to a point because, you know, if you buy a packet of cornflakes and you like them, you don't want the next packet to be ginger flavoured or something. So, nevertheless, things were incredibly predictable and rather pretentious and pompous, and very little of the music from that era, I think, actually stands much re-examination, which is why I don't bother to re-examine it. As I said, the bulk of bands that were successful at the time, musicians that were successful at the time, their success depended on them not changing too much. But Bowie managed to buck that trend, I think, and build success on not or without being predictable. In fact, with being, frankly, times it almost willfully unpredictable.
Whereas somebody can be really good at what they do and keep doing it, whether it's successful or not. I think David makes a point of changing, keeping changing.